After job hunting for 4 years, I finally landed a job as a supervisor for a warehouse. When I told my mother about the job, she said, "You don't deserve this job. You're better off working as an errand boy." She called the company and made sure my contract was canceled. So I left the city calmly. But what happened next was unexpected. Hello. Thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Arnold Ray from Texas. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. I remember the smell of burnt toast that morning, sharp and bitter, like a warning I didn't catch. The kitchen window was cracked open, letting in the damp chill of early spring, but it couldn't chase away the heaviness in the air. I sat at the table, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, staring at the steam curling upward like it had somewhere better to go. I'd been staring at that mug for hours, or maybe minutes. Time had a way of slipping through my fingers back then, like sand I couldn't hold. For years of job applications, rejection emails, and pitying looks from neighbors who'd whisper, "Poor Daniel, still trying to make something of himself." But that morning, everything was supposed to change. I'd landed a job. A real job. Supervisor at the warehouse on Elm Street. Not glamorous, sure, but it was mine. A lifeline. A chance to prove I wasn't the failure everyone thought I was. I remember the way my chest swelled when I got the call. Mr. Harris, the hiring manager, had a gravelly voice, like he smoked too much, but it was steady, certain. "Daniel, we're impressed with your persistence. Start Monday. Don't let us down. Don't let us down." Those words echoed in my head, louder than the trucks rumbling past our house. I'd clutched the phone so tight my knuckles turned white, and for the first time in years, I'd felt something like hope. Not the flimsy kind that crumbles under pressure, but the solid kind, the kind you can build a life on. I wanted to shout it from the rooftops, to tell the whole damn town. But first, I had to tell her. My mother, Linda. She was in the living room when I found her, perched on the edge of the couch like a bird ready to take flight. The TV was on, some talk show blaring about miracle diets, but she wasn't watching. She was knitting, her needles clicking like a metronome, steady and relentless. Her hands moved fast, too fast, like she was angry at the yarn. I stood in the doorway, my palms sweaty, my heart thudding against my ribs. "Mom," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted, like I was 10 years old again, asking for permission to stay up late. She didn't look up. "Mom, I got the job. Supervisor at the warehouse. I start Monday." The clicking stopped. She raised her head, and I saw her eyes, sharp and gray, like storm clouds rolling in. I braced myself for a smile, a nod, anything to show she was proud. But her lips twisted, thin and tight, like she'd bitten into something sour. "Supervisor," she said, and the word sounded dirty in her mouth, like it didn't belong there. "You? Daniel, don't be ridiculous. You don't deserve that job. You're better off running errands, fetching coffee, keeping things simple. You're not cut out for responsibility. You'll just mess it up, like always." I remember the way her words hit me, like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of my lungs. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but my throat tightened, and all I could do was stand there, staring at her, feeling smaller with every second. She went back to her knitting, the needles clicking again, louder now, like they were mocking me. I turned away, my hands clenched into fists, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is what she thinks of me. A failure. A nobody. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The next day, I went to the warehouse to sign the contract. I remember the smell of diesel and cardboard, the hum of forklifts in the distance. Mr. Harris was waiting for me, but his face wasn't steady anymore. It was tight, pinched, like he'd gotten bad news. "Daniel," he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, but we can't move forward. We got a call. Someone said you're unreliable, that you've got a history of letting people down. We can't take the risk." I remember the floor tilting under me, like the earth had shifted. "A call?" I said, my voice hoarse. Who called?" But I knew. I knew before he even answered, before he shrugged and looked away, before I stumbled out of the warehouse and into the gray drizzle of the afternoon. Linda, my own mother. She'd done this. She'd taken my lifeline and snapped it in half, like it was nothing. I confronted her that night. The house was dark, the only light coming from the flickering TV. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes, her back to me. Why? I said, and my voice cracked, raw and ragged. Why would you do this to me? She didn't turn around. I did it for your own good, she said, her tone flat, like she was reciting a grocery list. You're not ready for that kind of job, Daniel. You'd embarrass yourself. I was protecting you. Protecting me? I shouted, and the words echoed off the walls, loud and sharp. You ruined me. You took everything. She turned then, her eyes cold, unyielding. Don't raise your voice at me, she said. You're ungrateful. You've always been ungrateful. And that's when I saw him, my father, Michael, standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his hands stuffed in his pockets, and he said nothing. Not a word. Just stood there, silent, like he always did, letting her tear me apart. I remember the moment I decided to leave. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like a switch flipping in my head. I packed a bag that night, stuffing clothes and a few books into my old duffel, the one with the broken zipper. I didn't look at the photos on my dresser, didn't touch the childhood trophies gathering dust. I left a note for Michael, short and simple. I'm sorry. I can't stay. I didn't say goodbye to Linda. I couldn't. I walked out into the cold, the streetlights casting long shadows, and I remember feeling lighter with every step, like I was shedding a weight I'd carried too long. The bus station was empty, just me and the hum of the vending machine. I bought a ticket to the city, the cheapest one-way I could find. I sat on the bench, my bag at my feet, and I remember thinking, this is it. No going back. The bus pulled up, its headlights cutting through the dark, and I climbed aboard, the engine rumbling under me like a promise. I didn't look out the window as we left town. I didn't need to. I was done with this place, done with her. But as the miles stretched out, I felt it, a flicker of fear, sharp and cold, like a blade against my skin. Could I do this? Could I start over? Or was she right? Was I just a failure, running from the truth? The city hit me like a freight train, all noise and sharp edges, a tangle of lights and shadows that swallowed me whole. I remember stepping off the bus, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the air thick with exhaust, and the faint tang of rain on asphalt. The station was a chaos of voices, shouts, laughter, the crackle of a static-filled announcement overhead. I stood there, frozen, my boots rooted to the cracked tile, feeling like I'd landed on another planet. Back home, the streets were quiet, predictable, the kind of place where you knew every pothole and every face. Here I was nothing, a speck in a sea of strangers, each one moving with purpose, like they knew exactly where they belonged. I didn't belong. Not yet. I found a place to crash that first night, a rundown apartment on the edge of the city, the kind with peeling wallpaper and a radiator that clanked like it was auditioning for a horror movie. The landlord, a guy named Carl with a cigarette permanently glued to his lips, didn't ask questions. Just took my cash and handed me a key, the metal cold and heavy in my palm. I remember lying on the lumpy mattress that night, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, listening to the hum of traffic outside. It was louder than I expected, a constant buzz that pressed against my skull, like the city was reminding me it wouldn't let me rest. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I saw Linda's face, her gray eyes sharp and cold, her voice echoing in my head. You're not cut out for this, Daniel. You'll mess it up like always. I rolled over, burying my face in the pillow, but her words clung to me, heavy and suffocating, like a shadow I couldn't shake. The first few weeks were a blur, a grind of odd jobs and late nights, my hands always smelling like grease or bleach. I washed dishes at a diner, hauled boxes at a loading dock, even handed out flyers for a guy selling knockoff watches on the corner. The pay was barely enough to cover rent, and I remember the ache in my stomach, the way it growled when I skipped meals to save cash. But I didn't care. I wasn't doing this for comfort. I was doing it to prove her wrong, to prove I could survive without her, without that suffocating little town and its suffocating little expectations. I remember the weight of my phone in my pocket, the temptation to call Michael, to hear his quiet voice, to ask if he missed me. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. I started the business on a whim, or maybe desperation. Logistics, small scale, nothing fancy, just moving stuff from point A to point B. I'd always been good at organizing, at figuring out how things fit together, and I thought, why not? I bought a beat-up van from a guy on the internet, the kind with rust creeping up the sides like ivy, and I remember the way it rattled when I drove, like it was as nervous as I was. I printed flyers, cheap ones on flimsy paper, and handed them out at warehouses, corner stores, anywhere I thought someone might need a delivery. The first month was brutal. Calls didn't come, or when they did, they were small jobs, barely worth the gas. I remember sitting in the van one night, parked under a flickering streetlight, counting the coins in my cup holder, wondering if I'd made a mistake. "You're not cut out for this," Linda's voice whispered, and I slammed my fist against the dashboard, the pain sharp and grounding. I wasn't going to let her win. Then I met Elena. I remember the day, clear as glass, the way the sun cut through the clouds, warm and golden, like it was trying to cheer me up. I was at her cafe, a little place called the Daily Grind, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. I'd gone in for coffee, cheap and black, something to keep me awake. She was behind the counter, her hair streaked with gray, her apron stained with flour. She had this way of looking at you, like she could see right through to the parts you tried to hide. "Rough day," she said, her voice warm, like honey on toast. I shrugged, not wanting to talk, but she kept going, asking questions, pulling me out of myself. I told her about the business, the van, the struggle, and she listened, really listened, her eyes steady and kind. "You've got grit," she said, sliding a muffin across the counter, "on the house. That's more than most people have. Don't give up." Elena became my lifeline, my anchor in the chaos. She'd been where I was, she told me, starting over after her own family fell apart, building the cafe from nothing. I remember the stories she shared, late nights over coffee, the way her voice softened when she talked about her father, the way it hardened when she mentioned her mother. It was like looking in a mirror, her pain reflecting mine, and I felt less alone. She gave me advice, practical stuff, how to find clients, how to negotiate rates, but more than that, she gave me hope. "You're not defined by where you came from," she said once, her hands wrapped around a mug, her eyes locked on mine. "You're defined by what you do next." I remember the setback, the one that almost broke me. A client, a small warehouse, hired me for a big delivery, my first real chance to make a name for myself. I planned it down to the minute, every route, every stop, but the van, damn that van, broke down halfway, the engine coughing and dying like it had given up on me. I lost the client, lost the pay, lost a piece of myself. I remember sitting on the curb, the van towed away, my hands in my hair, feeling like Linda was right. I was a failure. I was nothing. But Elena found me, tracked me down like she knew I'd be there, and she sat beside me, silent for a while, just breathing. "You think this is the end?" she said finally, her voice sharp, cutting through my fog. "This is just a bump, Daniel. Get up. Try again." And I did. I fixed the van, found new clients, kept going. I remember the day it started to turn, the first big job, a warehouse on the other side of the city, needing regular deliveries. The pay was good, steady, and I felt it, a flicker of something, not just hope, but pride. I was doing this. I was building something. But that night, alone in my apartment, the radiator clanking, the city buzzing outside, I felt it again, that shadow, that doubt. Linda's voice, quiet but persistent. "You'll mess it up, like always." I pushed it down, buried it deep, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting, lurking, ready to strike. And I wondered, as I stared at the ceiling, the city stretching out beyond my window, if I'd ever be free of her. Or if I'd spend my life running, not towards something, but away. Success came like a lightning bolt, sudden and blinding, splitting my life into before and after. I remember the day it happened, the way the city felt different, softer somehow, like it had finally decided to let me breathe. 6 months had passed since I'd started the business, 6 months of grinding, of late nights in the van, of counting coins and praying the radiator wouldn't die. But that morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing like a beehive, notifications piling up faster than I could swipe. I squinted at the screen, bleary-eyed, expecting another late payment reminder or a spam email about car warranties. Instead, it was a message from a client, then another, then a flood, texts, emails, voicemails, all saying the same thing. Daniel, you're everywhere. You're viral. I remember the confusion, the way my heart stuttered, like it wasn't sure whether to race or stop. Viral? Me? I opened the app, the one I'd been posting updates on, mostly for myself, tracking deliveries, sharing tips for small businesses. Just boring stuff, I thought. Nothing special. But there it was, my latest post, a photo of the van, parked under a street light, captioned, "Another late night, another chance to prove them wrong." It had thousands of likes, shares, comments, numbers climbing by the second. I scrolled, my thumb shaking, and saw the tags, the mentions, the articles. A local news site had picked it up, calling me the underdog entrepreneur shaking up logistics. Then a bigger site, national, with a headline that made my stomach flip. From small town to big dreams, Daniel's delivery empire takes off. Empire? I laughed, sharp and short, because it was ridiculous. I wasn't an empire. I was just me, Daniel, with a rusty van and a dream I wasn't sure I deserved. The calls came next, clients I'd never heard of, warehouses, retailers, even a tech startup wanting weekly deliveries. I remember the first big contract, a furniture company needing regular shipments across the city. The pay was more than I'd made in months, and I signed the papers with trembling hands, the pen slipping in my sweaty grip. I upgraded the van, traded the rust bucket for something newer, smoother, with a hum instead of a rattle. I moved out of the apartment, the one with the clanking radiator, into a place with windows that didn't leak, a kitchen that didn't smell like mildew. I remember standing in the new place, the hardwood floors gleaming, the city skyline stretching out beyond the glass, and feeling it, a weight lifting, a space opening up inside me, like I could finally exhale. Elena threw a party at the cafe, her way of celebrating, though I think she just wanted an excuse to bake. I remember the smell of cinnamon rolls, warm and sweet, mixing with the tang of coffee, the chatter of customers filling the space. She'd hung a banner, handwritten in marker, "Congrats, Daniel," with a little van drawn in the corner, lopsided but perfect. My friends were there, the small circle I'd built, people who'd seen me at my lowest and stuck around. We laughed, clinked mugs, toasted to the future, and I remember the warmth in my chest, the kind that comes from belonging, from being seen. Elena pulled me aside, her gray-streaked hair catching the light, her eyes steady and kind. "You did this," she said, her voice low, like a secret. "Not them. Not her. You." I nodded, swallowing hard, but I couldn't shake the shadow, the flicker of doubt, the whisper that said, "This isn't real. You'll mess it up, like always." Success was loud, brighter than I expected, but it was lonely, too. I remember the nights, alone in the new apartment, the city humming outside, the silence inside pressing against my ears. I'd sit on the couch, scrolling through the news, seeing my name, my face, plastered across screens, and I'd wonder if she saw it. Linda. Did she know? Did she care? I imagined her in the living room, the TV flickering, her needles clicking, her lips twisting into that sour frown. "You don't deserve this," she'd say, and I'd push it down, bury it deep, but it was there, always there, like a splinter under my skin. I wanted to call Michael, to hear his quiet voice, to ask if he was proud, but I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Elena saw it, the way I carried it, the weight I couldn't shake. I remember the day she called me out, sitting across from me at the cafe, her mug steaming, her eyes sharp. "You're building something incredible, Daniel," she said, her voice firm, like she was trying to wake me up. "But you're still running. You're still proving her wrong, not proving yourself right. When are you going to let it go?" I stared at her, my throat tight, and I wanted to argue, to say I was fine, but I wasn't. I wasn't fine. Success was supposed to fix me, to fill the hole she'd left, but it didn't. It just made it louder, sharper, a void I couldn't ignore. I remember the email, the one that cracked me open. It came late, after midnight. The subject line simple, "Daniel, it's Dad." I sat there, staring at the screen, my finger hovering over the mouse, my heart pounding like a drum. "Michael," he'd written, after all this time, after all that silence. I read the first line, his words shaky, like he'd typed them with trembling hands. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I should have said something. I should have stopped her." I closed the laptop, my chest tight, my breath shallow, and I remember the anger, the hurt, the guilt, all of it crashing over me like a wave. I wanted to reply, to tell him it was too late, but I didn't. I couldn't. I wasn't ready. That night, I lay awake, the city buzzing outside, the skyline glowing through the window. I thought about Elena's words, about Michael's email, about Linda's shadow, still clinging to me, still whispering. Success was supposed to be the answer, the proof I wasn't a failure, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to silence her, to heal me, to make me whole. And I wondered, as the hours stretched thin, if I'd ever be free, or if I'd spend my life chasing something I couldn't name, something I wasn't sure I'd find. The email sat there, unopened, unanswered, a question I wasn't ready to face. And I knew, deep down, that the big break wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, the start of something harder, something deeper, something I wasn't sure I could handle. I wasn't ready for the town to feel so small, like it had shrunk in my absence, folding in on itself like a crumpled map. I remember stepping off the train, the platform cracked and gray, the air thick with the smell of diesel and damp leaves. The city had been loud, bright, a chaos of possibility, but here, everything was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, heavy and insistent. I'd come back for business, a meeting with a client who wanted to expand deliveries to the area, but I felt it, the weight of the place, like it was pulling me back, trying to swallow me whole. I adjusted my bag, the leather strap digging into my shoulder, and I remember thinking, just one day, get in, get out. Don't look back. The town hadn't changed, not really. The same storefronts, faded and peeling, the same potholes I used to dodge on my bike, the same faces peering out from behind curtains, their eyes sharp and curious. I remember the whispers, the way they followed me down Main Street, soft but piercing, like needles. That's Daniel, the one who made it big. Heard he's got a whole fleet of vans now. Linda must be so proud. I clenched my jaw, my hands stuffed in my pockets, and I wanted to laugh, sharp and bitter, because they didn't know. They didn't know what she'd done, how she'd tried to break me, how I'd had to claw my way out of her shadow. I kept walking, my boots echoing on the pavement, and I remember feeling exposed, like I was naked under their stares, like they could see the cracks I'd tried to patch up. I ended up at the community fair, not by choice, but because the client wanted to meet there, said it was easier, less formal. I remember the noise, the chatter of voices, the clink of bottles, the smell of fried dough and cotton candy, sweet and sticky. The fair was crowded, families weaving through booths, kids laughing, music blaring from a tinny speaker. I stood near the edge, my phone in my hand, pretending to check emails, but really, I was scanning the crowd, looking for the client, looking for an escape. And then I saw her. Linda. She was at a booth, handing out flyers for some church fundraiser, her gray hair pulled back, her face tight and pinched, like she was holding something in. Michael was beside her, his shoulders slumped, his hands stuffed in his pockets, and I remember the way my chest tightened, like a fist closing around my heart. She saw me first. I remember her eyes, sharp and gray, locking onto mine, and for a second, I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Then her face changed, softened, like she'd flipped a switch, and she smiled, wide and bright, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel, she said, her voice loud, carrying over the noise, and I remember the way it grated, like nails on a chalkboard. She moved toward me, arms outstretched, and I wanted to step back, to run, but I didn't. I stood there, letting her hug me, her grip tight and possessive, like she was claiming me. My boy, she said, her voice thick with something I couldn't name, something that made my skin crawl. Look at you, all grown up, making a name for yourself. I always knew you could do it. I remember the lie, the way it hung in the air, heavy and sour, like spoiled milk. I wanted to laugh, to shout, to tell her she was wrong, that she'd tried to ruin me, that she didn't get to claim this, but I didn't. I played along, my voice flat, my smile tight. Yeah, Mom, I said, and the word felt foreign, like it didn't belong in my mouth. Michael stepped forward, his face pale, his eyes darting between us, and I remember the silence, the way it stretched thin, like a thread ready to snap. Good to see you, son, he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, and I nodded, my throat tight, because I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to feel. Linda kept talking, her voice loud, performative, like she was putting on a show for the crowd. "My Daniel, running a whole empire now," she said, her hands gesturing, her eyes flicking to the people around us, making sure they heard. "I always told him he had potential, didn't I, Michael?" I remember the way Michael nodded, his lips pressed thin, and I wanted to scream, to tell her to stop, to tell them all the truth, but I didn't. I stood there, my hands clenched, my nails digging into my palms, and I remember the anger, the hurt, the way it burned, sharp and hot, like a coal in my chest. I left as soon as I could, after the client showed up, after the meeting, after Linda tried to pull me into another hug, another lie. I remember the walk back to the hotel, the streets dark, the air cold, the silence louder than the fare. I called Elena from my room, the phone pressed to my ear, my voice shaky. "I saw them," I said, and she listened, her silence steady, grounding. She pretended, Elena. She pretended she was proud, like she didn't try to ruin me. Elena's voice was firm, sharp, like a blade cutting through fog. "You don't owe them anything, Daniel," she said. "Not her, not him. You owe yourself peace. Don't let her pull you back." I remember the weight of her words, the way they settled, heavy and true. I lay on the bed, the ceiling fan spinning above me, the city skyline replaced by the dull beige of the hotel room, and I thought about Linda's smile, Michael's silence, the way they'd stood there, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I had changed. I wasn't the Daniel who'd left, the Daniel who'd begged for her approval, the Daniel who'd believed her lies. I was stronger now, harder, but I felt it, the crack, the wound, the shadow she'd left, still clinging to me, still whispering. And I wondered, as the night stretched thin, if I'd ever be free, or if I'd spend my life running, not towards something, but away. The next morning, my phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with her name. Linda. I remember the way my stomach dropped, the way my hand hesitated, hovering over the screen. I answered, my voice flat, guarded. "Daniel," she said, and her tone was different, softer, pleading. "It's your dad. He's sick, Daniel. Really sick. We need help, money for treatment. Your family. You can't turn your back on us." I remember the silence, the way it stretched, heavy and suffocating, and I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not yet. I remember the silence after Linda's call, the way it hung in the hotel room, thick and heavy, like smoke I couldn't clear. Her voice echoed in my head, softer than I'd ever heard it, but laced with something sharp, something manipulative, like a hook disguised as a plea. "Your family, Daniel. You can't turn your back on us." I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone still warm in my hand, my knuckles white from gripping it too tight. The ceiling fan spun above me, slow and steady, casting shadows that flickered across the walls, and I remember feeling trapped, like the room was shrinking, like the town was closing in, pulling me back into the life I'd fought so hard to escape. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone against the wall, to shatter the silence, but I didn't. I just sat there, my breath shallow, my heart pounding, and I knew, deep down, that this was it. The moment I'd been running from, the moment I'd have to face. I remember the memories, the way they came unbidden, sharp and vivid, like shards of glass cutting through my mind. I saw Linda in the kitchen, her hands scrubbing dishes, her back to me, her voice flat and cold. "You're not ready for that job, Daniel. You'd embarrass yourself. I was protecting you." I saw Michael in the doorway, his face pale, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his silence louder than her words, a betrayal all its own. I saw the bus station, the streetlights casting long shadows, the engine rumbling under me as I left, promising myself I'd never come back. But here I was, back in this town, back in her orbit, and she thought she could pull me in again, thought she could guilt me into saving them, thought I owed her something. I remember the anger, the way it burned, hot and sharp, like a coal in my chest, and I knew I couldn't let her win. Not this time. I called her back. I remember the ring, the way it stretched. Each tone a second I could change my mind, but I didn't. She answered on the third ring, her voice hesitant, hopeful. "Daniel," she said, and I could hear it, the strain, the desperation, the way she was trying to play me. "I'm glad you called back. I knew you'd understand. We're family, after all." I remember the pause, the way I let it stretch, letting her words hang there, letting her think she'd won. Then I spoke, my voice flat, steady, colder than I'd ever heard it. "You're not family," I said, and the words felt heavy, final, like a door slamming shut. You stopped being family the day you called the warehouse, the day you tried to ruin me. You don't get to ask for help now. You don't get to claim me. I remember the silence, the way it crackled, sharp and electric, like a storm about to break. Then she spoke, her voice rising, shrill and frantic. "How dare you," she said, and I could hear the tears, the anger, the guilt she was trying to wield like a weapon. "Your father is sick, Daniel. He needs you. You can't just turn your back on us. You owe us this." I remember the laugh, sharp and bitter, the way it escaped me before I could stop it. "Oh, you," I said, and my voice was louder now, raw and ragged, like it had been waiting for this moment. "I owe you nothing. You tried to break me, Linda. You tried to keep me small, to keep me under your thumb, and when I fought back, you sabotaged me." Michael stood there, silent, letting you do it. "You don't get to call me family now. You don't get to ask for anything." I remember the sound of her breathing, fast and shallow, like she was gasping for air. Then she spoke, her voice low, venomous, like a snake striking. "You're selfish," she said, and I could hear the tears, the way they thickened her words, but I knew they weren't real, not for me, not for Michael, just for herself. "You've always been selfish, Daniel. Running off, leaving us behind, building your little empire. You think you're better than us, don't you? You think you can just erase us?" I remember the silence, the way I let it stretch, letting her words hang there, letting them burn themselves out. Then I spoke, my voice quiet, final. "Goodbye, Linda," I said, and I hung up, my fingers steady, my heart pounding. I blocked her number, the screen flashing, and I remember the weight, the way it lifted, like I'd shed a chain I'd carried too long. I remember the aftermath, the way the room felt different, quieter, lighter, but not easier. I lay on the bed, the fan spinning above me, the shadows flickering, and I thought about Michael, about the email he'd sent, the apology I hadn't answered. I remembered the way he'd stood there at the fair, his face pale, his eyes darting, his silence deafening. I wanted to feel sorry for him, to feel something, but all I felt was anger, hurt, guilt, all of it tangled together, like a knot I couldn't untie. I called Elena, the phone pressed to my ear, my voice shaky. "I did it," I said, and she listened, her silence steady, grounding. I told her she's not family. I blocked her, but I don't know if I did the right thing. Elena's voice was firm, sharp, like a blade cutting through fog. "You did what you needed to, Daniel," she said. "You set a boundary. That's not cruelty. That's strength. But you need to find closure for yourself, not for her." I remember the weight of her words, the way they settled, heavy and true. I thought about Linda, isolated and desperate, facing the consequences of her actions. I thought about Michael, sick and silent, caught between her and me. I thought about the bus, the city, the life I'd built, the life I'd fought for. And I wondered, as the night stretched thin, if I'd ever be free, or if I'd spend my life running, not towards something, but away. The next morning, I saw a message from a local friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Heard about your mom," it said, and I remember the way my stomach dropped, the way my hand hesitated, hovering over the screen. "She's struggling, Daniel. No one's helping. It's bad." I remember the flicker, the pity, the guilt, but I pushed it down, buried it deep, and I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not yet. I remember the city skyline, the way it stretched out beyond my window, a tangle of lights and shadows, sharp and bright, like a promise I'd finally learned to trust. I was back in my apartment, the one with the hardwood floors and the view that still took my breath away, and I remember feeling different, lighter somehow, like I'd shed a weight I'd carried too long. The town, the fair, Linda's call, they felt like echoes now, distant and faint, like footsteps fading down a hallway. But they weren't gone, not really. They lingered, soft but persistent, like the hum of traffic outside, like the shadow I couldn't quite shake. I sat on the couch, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, the steam curling upward, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is where I decide who I am. I'd made my choice, or at least I thought I had. I remember the decision, the way it settled, heavy and final, like a stone dropping into water. I wasn't going to reconnect with Linda, wasn't going to let her pull me back into that suffocating little town, that suffocating little life. But Michael was different. I remember the guilt, the way it gnawed at me, sharp and insistent, like a splinter under my skin. I thought about his email, the one I hadn't answered, the apology I hadn't acknowledged. I thought about his face at the fair, pale and tired, his eyes darting, his silence deafening. I wanted to hate him, to blame him for standing there, letting her tear me apart, but I couldn't. Not completely. He was part of me, part of the boy I'd been, the boy who'd loved him, who'd needed him, who'd waited for him to speak. And I remember the moment I decided, sitting there in the quiet, the city buzzing outside, that I couldn't leave him like that, not entirely. I paid for his treatment, or part of it, anonymously. I remember the process, the way it felt, like a secret I was keeping from myself. I called the hospital, gave them a fake name, wired the money, made sure Linda wouldn't know. It wasn't for her. It wasn't even for him, not really. It was for me, for the boy who'd sat at the kitchen table, waiting for his dad to say something, anything, to make it right. I remember the relief, the way it washed over me, soft and warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was closure, or as close as I could get. I didn't tell Elena, didn't tell anyone. I just did it, and I remember thinking, this is enough. This is all I can give. I remember the days that followed, the way they stretched, quiet and steady, like a rhythm I'd finally learned to follow. The business was thriving, clients calling, contracts piling up, the van fleet growing. I hired a few drivers, trained them myself, watched them pull out of the lot, their headlights cutting through the dark. I remember the pride, the way it felt, solid and real, like a foundation I'd built with my own hands. Elena was there, always there, her cafe a second home, her voice a steady anchor. I remember the nights we spent talking, mugs steaming, her gray-streaked hair catching the light, her eyes sharp and kind. "You're doing it, Daniel," she said once, her voice low, like a secret. "You're building a life, not just a business. Don't forget that." I nodded, swallowing hard, and I remember the warmth, the way it settled, like a promise I could keep. But Linda, she was still there, in the corners of my mind, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between. I remember the message from the friend, the one who'd told me she was struggling, isolated, desperate. I thought about her in that house, the TV flickering, the needles clicking, her face tight and pinched, like she was holding something in. I remember the flicker, the pity, the guilt, but I pushed it down, buried it deep, and I knew, deep down, that I couldn't save her. She'd made her choices, just like I'd made mine. I remember the letter, the one Michael sent, the one I found in my mailbox, the handwriting shaky, like he'd written it with trembling hands. "Daniel," it began, and I remember the way my chest tightened, the way my hand hesitated, hovering over the envelope. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Not yet. I put it in a drawer, the one with the old photos and the childhood trophies, and I remember thinking, maybe someday. But not today. I remember the final night, the one that felt like an ending, or maybe a beginning. I stood at the window, the city skyline stretching out, the lights flickering, the shadows shifting. I thought about the bus, the way it had rumbled under me, carrying me away from that town, that life, that pain. I thought about the van, the way it had rattled, the way it had carried me forward, towards something new, something mine. I thought about Elena, her voice steady, her hands warm, her belief in me stronger than my own. I thought about Linda, her gray eyes sharp and cold, her words cutting, her shadow lingering. I thought about Michael, his silence, his guilt, his letter, unopened, waiting. And I remember the smile, small and quiet, the way it curved my lips, the way it felt, like a release, like a promise. I was thriving, surrounded by the life I'd built, the chosen family I'd found. But I carried it, the weight, the fracture, the echoes of absence. Linda, isolated and regretful, facing the consequences of her choices. Michael, recovering, writing letters I wasn't ready to read. And me, here, now, looking out at the city, feeling both grounded and free, with a sense of possibility ahead. I remember the unopened letter, the way it sat there, a question I wasn't ready to answer, a door I wasn't ready to open. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end, not really. It was a pause, a breath, a moment to rest before the next step, the next journey, the next piece of myself I'd have to find. I turned away from the window, the city buzzing behind me, and I remember thinking, this is enough. For now, this is enough. Hey, thanks for sticking with me through this story. I know it's been a ride, full of pain, growth, and those quiet moments that hit you right in the chest. If Daniel's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of family, the struggle to break free, or the bittersweet relief of finding your own path, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below, tell me what part hit you the hardest, or share your own story of resilience. Let's build a community where we can talk about these moments, the ones that shape us, the ones we carry. And if you haven't already, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you're loving these stories. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next one. I've got more tales lined up, stories about breaking cycles, finding chosen family, and chasing dreams, and I can't wait to share them with you. Thanks for being here, for listening, for feeling. Let's keep this journey going together. See you in the next story.